January 1944. The cold Atlantic wind swept across the tarmac at Prestwick Airport in Scotland as General Dwight David Eisenhower stepped off the transport plane onto British soil. He had been here before, of course. He had commanded operations in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. But this time was different. This time, he was arriving as the Supreme Allied Commander, tasked with planning and executing Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France that would determine the fate of the free world. Eisenhower expected resistance. He expected logistical challenges. He expected the usual friction between Allied partners, the delicate dance of American ambition and British experience. What he did not expect, what none of the American generals arriving in Britain that winter expected, was to be absolutely stunned by what the British had already accomplished. The Americans came with confidence born of industrial might. They had built more ships, more planes, more tanks than any nation in history. They had mobilized an economy that turned out weapons at a pace that defied comprehension. They assumed, perhaps not unreasonably, that when it came to planning the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, American organizational prowess would take the lead and British traditionalism would follow. They were wrong. What Eisenhower and his staff discovered in the first weeks of 1944 was not a preliminary sketch waiting for American refinement. It was a masterpiece already in progress. A plan so comprehensive, so innovative, so audacious in its scope and detail that it redefined what the Americans thought was possible. The British, working under a planning structure called COSSAC, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, had spent over a year developing not just a plan, but an entirely new way of thinking about amphibious warfare. The shocked reactions began almost immediately. General Omar Bradley, who would command American ground forces on D-Day, arrived expecting to find planning committees still debating beach selections and tide tables. Instead, he found detailed models of every yard of the Normandy coastline, complete with German defensive positions marked down to individual machine gun nests. The intelligence work alone represented thousands of hours of reconnaissance flights, reports from French resistance fighters, and analysis that cross-referenced geological surveys dating back decades. But intelligence gathering, impressive as it was, represented only the beginning. As American planners settled into their new headquarters at Bushy Park in Southwick House, they began to understand the true scope of what the British had engineered. There were plans within plans, operations within operations, each layer more elaborate than the last. There were fake armies assembling in southeast England, complete with inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft. There were artificial harbors being constructed in pieces across dozens of secret locations. There was a pipeline, an actual pipeline, being prepared to run along the floor of the English Channel to pump fuel directly to the invasion forces. General George Patton, never a man easily impressed, stood in a briefing room in early February and listened as British planners described Operation Fortitude, the massive deception operation designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The plan involved fictional armies, double agents, fake radio traffic, and a level of psychological warfare that Patton, for all his tactical brilliance, had never conceived. He leaned over to Bradley afterward and muttered something that perfectly captured the American reaction. "If these limeys can lie this well to the Germans, I'd hate to play poker with them." The Americans had come to lead. They found themselves scrambling to catch up. This is not a story about American inadequacy. The United States military in 1944 was the most powerful fighting force the world had ever seen, and American innovation, courage, and sacrifice would prove essential to victory. But it is a story about assumptions challenged and respect earned. It is a story about how British engineers, planners, and military minds, working under the constant threat of German bombing and with resources far more limited than those available to their American allies, had created something extraordinary. It is also a story about the birth of modern military planning. The innovations developed for D-Day, the integration of intelligence and operations, the coordination of multi-service and multinational forces, the use of deception as a strategic weapon, the engineering solutions to seemingly impossible logistical problems would define how wars were fought for generations to come. American generals did not just learn from British preparations for D-Day, They witnessed the future of warfare being born. Let us begin at the beginning, in a nondescript office building in London, where a British general and his small staff started planning the impossible. The foundation, COSSAC, and the plan before Eisenhower. In the spring of 1943, months before Eisenhower received his appointment as Supreme Allied Commander, a British lieutenant general named Frederick Morgan received what appeared to be an impossible assignment. He was designated Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, COSSAC for short, with one small problem. There was no Supreme Allied Commander yet. Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed that an invasion of France was necessary, but had not yet decided who would lead it, or even definitively when it would occur. Morgan's job was to plan an invasion without knowing who would execute it or exactly when it would happen. He was given a small staff, access to limited resources, and told to solve problems that had no obvious solutions. The British had attempted a raid on the French port of Dieppe in August 1942, and it had been a catastrophe. Of the 6,000 troops who went ashore, 2,000 were killed or captured, and the operation achieved nothing except to demonstrate that German coastal defenses were formidable and that amphibious assaults on fortified positions were extraordinarily difficult. Morgan and his team drew several lessons from Dieppe. First, they could not simply assault a heavily defended port. The Germans would expect that, would fortify ports to the maximum, and ensure that even if the Allies captured a port, the facilities would be destroyed and unusable for months. Second, they needed overwhelming force at the point of assault. The Dieppe raid had been too small, too lightly supported, too easily contained. Third, they needed surprise, both strategic and tactical. If the Germans knew where and when the invasion was coming, they would concentrate forces and make the operation exponentially more costly, if not impossible. From these lessons, COSSAC developed a radical proposal. Instead of attacking a port, they would attack beaches, specifically a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline between the Orne River and the Cotentin Peninsula. This area had several advantages. It was within range of British fighter aircraft based in southern England, ensuring air superiority over the invasion beaches. It was less heavily fortified than the Pas de Calais, the obvious invasion route that the Germans expected and therefore had reinforced with some of their best divisions. And it offered the possibility, once the beaches were secured, of capturing the port of Cherbourg to supply the invasion force. But attacking beaches rather than a port created a massive logistical problem. How do you supply an army of hundreds of thousands of men without a port? How do you offload tanks, artillery, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and all the other necessities of modern warfare? COSSAC's answer was breathtaking in its audacity. They would build their own ports and bring them with them. They would construct artificial harbors in Britain, tow them across the English Channel, and assemble them off the Normandy coast to create sheltered water where ships could unload in safety. The engineering challenges were staggering. The harbors would need to be large enough to handle dozens of ships simultaneously, sturdy enough to withstand channel storms, and complex enough to function in all tidal conditions. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. That was only the beginning. COSSAC planners realized that even with artificial harbors, the invasion force would consume fuel at a rate that would overwhelm conventional supply methods. Tanker ships were slow, vulnerable to air attack and submarines, and would clog the invasion routes. So COSSAC proposed another seemingly impossible solution: build pipelines under the English Channel to pump fuel directly from Britain to France. Engineers and oil company executives were consulted. Most said it could not be done. The pressure required would be immense. The pipe would need to be flexible enough to lay along the irregular seafloor, and the entire system would have to be disguised from German reconnaissance. COSSAC pushed forward anyway. Then there was the question of German defenses. By mid-1943, Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of fortifications along the entire Western European coast. Concrete bunkers, steel obstacles on the beaches, millions of mines, interlocking fields of fire from artillery and machine guns. The Atlantic Wall was designed to make any amphibious assault suicidal. Standard tanks and infantry would be cut to pieces. COSSAC's solution was to develop specialized armored vehicles that could overcome these defenses, tanks that could swim,
tanks that could clear mines by beating the ground with rotating chains, tanks that could lay bridges over anti-tank ditches, tanks that could destroy concrete bunkers with demolition charges. A British general named Percy Hobart was given the task of developing these vehicles, and by the time American planners arrived in 1944, he had created an entire division of specialized armor, unlike anything in military history. And then there was deception. COSSAC understood that even with all the advantages of surprise, specialized equipment, and careful planning, the invasion would fail if the Germans had time to concentrate forces in Normandy. They needed the Germans looking the wrong way, expecting the invasion somewhere else, holding their reserves in place, waiting for an attack that would never come. This meant creating an entire phantom military force, complete with fake headquarters, dummy equipment, and false radio traffic. It meant using double agents to feed misleading information to German intelligence. It meant constructing a web of lies so elaborate and so convincing that Hitler himself would believe it. The operation would eventually be codenamed Fortitude, and it would become one of the most successful deception campaigns in military history. All of this, the beach selection, the artificial harbors, the underwater pipelines, the specialized armor, the deception plans, was in development before Eisenhower arrived. COSSAC had been working for 8 months when the Americans began arriving in force in late 1943 and early 1944. The plan was not finished, but the foundation was solid, the innovations were real, and the scope was stunning. General Morgan briefed Eisenhower and his deputy, British General Bernard Montgomery, on the COSSAC plan in early January 1944. Both men immediately saw its strengths and its weaknesses. The plan was brilliant in conception, but too limited in scale. COSSAC had proposed landing 3 divisions initially, with 2 more in immediate support. Montgomery, who had commanded troops in North Africa and knew the importance of overwhelming force, insisted the invasion needed to be much larger. He wanted 5 divisions landing simultaneously across a broader front, with 3 additional airborne divisions dropping behind enemy lines to secure key positions and disrupt German counterattacks. This expansion created new problems. More divisions meant more landing craft, more ships, more supplies, more coordination. It meant delaying the invasion by a month to assemble the necessary resources. It meant expanding the artificial harbor plans, extending the pipeline routes, building more specialized armor. But Eisenhower agreed with Montgomery. If they were going to do this, they needed to do it with enough force to guarantee success. American planners, settling into their roles in the expanding headquarters structure, began to grasp the magnitude of what the British had created. This was not just an invasion plan, it was a comprehensive reimagining of how large-scale amphibious operations could be conducted. The COSSAC staff had thought through problems that American planners had not yet considered and had developed solutions that seemed to belong in science fiction rather than military planning. General Bradley, reviewing the beach reconnaissance data, found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. The British had conducted covert surveys of the Normandy beaches using miniature submarines, had analyzed the composition of the sand and rock to determine if it would support heavy vehicles, had cataloged every German defensive position visible from the sea. They had even collected samples of the seabed to test whether the artificial harbor foundations would hold in the soil and rock beneath the waves. The depth of preparation extended to aspects of the invasion that American planners had barely begun to consider. What about refueling aircraft returning from missions over the invasion beaches? The British had that covered. They were preparing advanced landing grounds in southern England that could be operational immediately to support fighter operations. What about medical care for the thousands of expected casualties? British planners had organized an entire medical infrastructure with hospital ships, beach clearing stations, and evacuation procedures that would move wounded men from the front lines to hospitals in England with maximum efficiency. What about the French civilian population? There would be French people living in Normandy, and the invasion would bring war to their doorsteps. COSSAC had coordinated with Free French forces and had prepared leaflets, radio broadcasts, and civil affairs teams to work with the local population. They had stockpiled food, medicine, and supplies for civilian relief. They had prepared for everything. The Americans brought to the partnership their own strengths: industrial capacity, vast numbers of troops, innovative thinking, and a willingness to take risks. But they came to respect the British preparation as something special, a level of thoroughness and innovation that exceeded expectations. Eisenhower, who would lead the combined force, recognized that the foundation COSSAC had built was sound. His job now was to expand it, to add American power to British planning and turn this extraordinary preparation into reality. But before we examine the specific innovations that most shocked American generals, we need to understand the single most audacious element of the entire D-Day plan, the greatest military deception in history. Operation Fortitude, the War of Lies. In a secure briefing room in early February 1944, a group of American generals sat in stunned silence as British intelligence officers explained Operation Fortitude. The plan they were hearing seemed more appropriate to a spy novel than to military operations. It involved fake armies, phantom generals, double agents with code names like Garbo and Tricycle, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and a web of lies so elaborate and so convincing that Hitler himself would believe it. The operation would eventually be codenamed Fortitude, and it would become one of the most successful deception campaigns in military history. Patton, who would later command Third Army in the breakout from Normandy, found himself at the center of the deception. The British proposed making him the ostensible commander of a fictional force called the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. This phantom army would be stationed in southeast England, across from Pas-de-Calais, threatening the shortest crossing of the English Channel. The Germans, British intelligence believed, would expect Patton to lead the main invasion. They were the general they most feared. If they thought he was in command of FUSAG in Kent, they would keep their strongest forces at Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. Patton's ego was simultaneously flattered and bruised. He was being used as bait in an elaborate trap, which meant the British recognized his reputation. But he was also being kept out of the actual initial invasion, which meant he would not be leading the first troops ashore. He would have to wait, sitting in England while others earned glory in Normandy, all so the Germans would continue to believe the real invasion was yet to come. The scope of Fortitude staggered the Americans. It was not just a single deception, but a layered campaign with multiple components operating simultaneously. Fortitude South, the part involving Patton and FUSAG, designed to convince the Germans the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Fortitude North was meant to threaten Norway, forcing the Germans to keep divisions stationed in Scandinavia that might otherwise be sent to France. And underlying all of this was an intricate intelligence operation that had been years in the making. British MI5, the Internal Security Service, had accomplished something remarkable. They had captured virtually every German agent sent to Britain and made many of them into double agents working for the Allies. The Germans thought they had an extensive spy network in the UK feeding them intelligence. In reality, every report those agents sent to Berlin was carefully crafted by British intelligence to support Fortitude deception. The star of this covert operation was a Spanish citizen named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Garcia volunteered to spy for Britain against the Nazis, motivated by hatred of fascism. He was so effective at building a fictional network of informants that the Germans believed he ran 27 sub-agents across Britain, all feeding him information. In reality, Garcia was alone in London, inventing reports based on a detailed study of British newspapers, maps, and reference books, then sending them through Portuguese contacts to their German handlers in Madrid. Garbo's fictional network was perfect for Fortitude. His invented agents could report on FUSAG's activities, confirm troop movements that never happened, describe equipment that existed only as canvas and inflated rubber. The Germans trusted Garbo completely. He had been providing intelligence for years.
In fields across southeastern England, engineers created entire military encampments. They constructed dummy landing craft, hundreds of them, made from canvas stretched over steel frames and wood. From the air, these fakes looked identical to real landing craft. They built inflatable tanks, rubber and canvas vehicles that could be inflated in minutes and that, when properly painted and positioned, appeared in aerial photographs to be entire tank formations. They created fake oil storage facilities, false ammunition dumps, dummy airfields complete with plywood aircraft. The scale of this fabrication was immense. Thousands of workers were employed in creating the fake equipment. Artists and set designers from the film industry were brought in to ensure the deceptions would stand up to photographic reconnaissance. Radio operators transmitted fake messages between fictional units. Signal Corps specialists generated false electronic traffic. Every element had to be coordinated to create a consistent, believable picture. American engineers, brought in to help expand the deception as more U.S. units arrived, found themselves building phantom divisions. They laid out entire camps that would never house real soldiers, positioned fake vehicles in formation, even created dummy tracks through muddy fields to simulate the passage of heavy equipment. The work was tedious, detailed, and absolutely essential. What shocked the Americans most was not just the scale of the deception, but its effectiveness. British intelligence, through ultra-intercepts of German communications, could read enemy assessments in near real time. The Germans were buying it completely. Hitler himself believed in FUSAG. German intelligence estimated the Allied forces in Britain at 89 divisions, when the real number was closer to 35. They placed FUSAG in Kent with 12 divisions under Patton's command, all of them fictional. The deception was so good that it continued to work after D-Day itself. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6th, the Germans initially believed it was a diversion. The real invasion, they thought, would come at Calais under Patton. They held the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for FUSAG to strike. Days passed. The beachhead expanded. Still, the Germans kept their best divisions at Calais, waiting for Patton. It took 7 weeks before Hitler finally realized he had been deceived. 7 weeks during which entire German divisions sat idle at Calais, while the Allies built up overwhelming force in Normandy. 7 weeks that gave the Allies time to land more than 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. 7 weeks that turned what could have been a desperate struggle into an operation with enough margin for error to absorb setbacks and continue advancing. General Bradley, reviewing the intelligence assessments after the war, called fortitude the single most important factor in the success of D-Day. Without it, he believed, the Germans would have rushed reinforcements to Normandy, would have contained the beachhead, might have pushed the invasion back into the sea. Patton, typically blunt, said that fortitude had killed more Germans than his entire Third Army by keeping them in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Americans had come to Britain thinking they understood military operations. They knew tactics, logistics, combined arms warfare, but fortitude taught them something new, that modern war was as much about information as ammunition, that a well-crafted lie could be as deadly as a bomber, that intelligence operations were not just a support function, but could be the decisive factor in victory. British intelligence officers, in briefing after briefing that winter and spring, walked American planners through every aspect of fortitude. They explained the psychology of deception, how you built credibility gradually, how you mixed truth and fiction in ways that reinforced the enemy's own expectations and fears. They demonstrated how double agents were managed, how messages were crafted, how evidence was fabricated. The Americans learned.
They absorbed the lessons, and when they returned to the Pacific Theater or planned operations in Italy, they brought with them a new appreciation for the power of deception. The U.S. military would go on to create its own deception units, would develop its own sophisticated intelligence operations. But it started here, in those briefings about Fortitude, watching the British spin a web of lies that would change the course of the war. Yet, as remarkable as Fortitude was, it represented only one element of British preparation that shocked American generals. Perhaps even more impressive because it required not just clever thinking, but engineering on a scale never before attempted, were the Mulberry Harbors. Mulberry Harbors, engineering the impossible. Winston Churchill stood in his bath at 10 Downing Street, staring at the problem that had defeated him for months. He had suggested portable harbors as early as 1917 during the Great War, floating piers that could be towed into position to supply forces landing on enemy beaches. The idea had been ignored then. Now, in 1942, as he contemplated invading Europe, the problem returned with even greater urgency. The Dieppe raid had proven that capturing a port by direct assault was nearly impossible. German defenders could concentrate forces at ports, could fortify them with interlocking fields of fire, could demolish the port facilities before retreating, leaving the Allies with nothing. Yet, without a port, how could an invasion force be supplied? Conventional landing craft could bring troops and initial supplies ashore, but they could not sustain an army of hundreds of thousands fighting their way across France. Churchill issued a memo in May 1942, Piers for Use on Beaches. In characteristic style, he had not asked if such a thing was possible, he simply demanded it be done. He wrote, "They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves." Now, soaking in his bath, Churchill visualized the solution. The tide in the English Channel rose and fell dramatically, as much as 20 feet in some locations. Any pier would have to accommodate this massive tidal range, floating up and down while remaining functional. Conventional piers were fixed to the seabed. These would need to be anchored but flexible, able to rise and fall with the tide while maintaining stable connections to shore and to ships. Churchill's bathtub revelation launched one of the most remarkable engineering projects of the war. Over the next 2 years, British engineers, working in collaboration with oil companies, civilian contractors, and military planners, would design and build 2 complete artificial harbors, each roughly the size of Dover, one of Britain's largest ports, and capable of handling thousands of tons of supplies daily. When American generals first heard about the Mulberry Harbor project in early 1944, their reactions ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. General Bradley thought it was a joke, some kind of British humor he didn't understand. Artificial harbors, towed across the English Channel? It seemed like something from a Jules Verne novel, not a serious military plan. Then the British took American planners to see the construction. In the Thames estuary and along the Clyde River, massive construction projects were underway. Dry docks that had been hastily built or expanded were producing enormous concrete caissons called Phoenix units. These caissons were hollow chambers, 60 feet tall and 200 feet long, built from 31,000 tons of steel and 1.5 million cubic yards of concrete. Each one represented a major engineering work in itself. There would be 146 of them, forming the main breakwaters of the 2 harbors. The Americans watched as these massive structures were built, flooded to sink them in place awaiting D-Day, then refloated through an elaborate pumping operation. The logistics of the refloating alone were staggering. The original plan had called for sewage pumps, which proved inadequate. An American naval officer, Captain Edward Ellsberg, an expert in marine salvage, reviewed the British plans and determined they needed more powerful pumps and better coordination. Churchill intervened personally, took the operation away from the Royal Engineers, and gave it to the Royal Navy, which assembled every salvage barge in the British Isles to manage the refloating. The complexity of the project kept expanding as American planners learned more. The caissons were only the outer breakwater. Inside the protected area created by the Phoenix units, floating steel roadways, called whales, would connect to shore. These flexible piers, made of steel pontoons, would rise and fall with the tide, remaining level with the decks of ships at all times. Ships could dock, unload directly onto trucks, and the trucks could drive across the floating roadways to shore. To further protect the harbors from storms, old merchant ships would be deliberately sunk in lines parallel to the coast, creating additional barriers against waves. These block ships, called gooseberries, would shelter smaller landing craft even before the full harbors were operational, and beyond the block ships, floating steel breakwaters, called bombardons, would absorb the energy of storm waves, creating calm water within the harbor area. The entire system was modular, designed to be assembled rapidly under combat conditions. Components were being built in secret locations all across Britain, in London, along the Scottish coast, in obscure river estuaries where German reconnaissance was unlikely to spot them. Security was so tight that workers often had no idea what they were building. They knew their specific piece, their specific task, but not how it fit into the larger plan. General Bradley, touring one of the Phoenix construction sites, asked the British officer guiding him how they planned to move these massive structures across the channel. The officer explained that they would be refloated on D-Day, then towed by ocean-going tugs. The caissons would float with just a few feet visible above water. Once at the Normandy coast, they would be positioned precisely and then flooded again to sink them into place, forming the breakwater. The entire harbor would be assembled within days of the initial landing. Bradley was skeptical. What about German resistance? What if the caissons were sunk prematurely by enemy fire or mined by U-boats? The British acknowledged the risks but had planned for them. Multiple caissons would be available. The towing routes would be swept for mines. The Royal Navy would provide escort and protection. The operation had to succeed because without the harbors, the invasion could not be sustained. 2 harbors were planned, Mulberry A for American forces off Omaha Beach at St. Laurent-sur-Mer, and Mulberry B for British and Canadian forces off Gold Beach at Arromanches. Each would require miles of floating roadways, dozens of caissons, hundreds of personnel to operate and maintain the facilities. The combined chiefs of staff had estimated the harbors would need to handle 12,000 tons of supplies daily in all weather conditions. American engineers, trained in different methods and different scales of construction, studied the British plans with growing respect. The engineering was sound, even brilliant. The British had solved problems the Americans had not fully considered. How do you anchor a floating pier to the seabed without it tearing loose in a storm? The British had developed special anchors and mooring systems tested in the Solent and other protected waters. How do you ensure vehicles can drive on and off floating roadways that are constantly moving with the waves? The British had designed the pontoons with minimal movement, connected by flexible joints that distributed stress. The scale of the undertaking became clearer as D-Day approached. Over 1 million tons of steel and concrete would be towed across the English Channel. Thousands of workers had labored for months to build the components. Special ships had been modified to lay the components in place. Everything had been tested as much as possible, but the true test would come only when the harbors were assembled under fire off the coast of France. The Americans brought their own expertise to the project. U.S. Navy Seabees, construction battalions known for their engineering skill and ability to work under fire, would help assemble Mulberry A. American pontoon units would provide additional floating causeways. The collaboration between British design and American muscle was precisely the kind of partnership Eisenhower had hoped to forge. But doubt remained. General Patton, visiting the construction sites in April 1944, watched caissons being moved and muttered that the whole thing seemed impossible. "Damned if I know how they think this will work, but damned if I don't hope they're right." D-Day would vindicate the British vision, though not without cost. The harbors became operational within days of the landing, exactly as planned. Ships could unload safely while the Allied armies pushed inland. Then, on June 19th, a massive storm hit the English Channel. For 3 days, the worst weather in decades pounded the Normandy coast. Mulberry A, the American harbor, had been inadequately anchored. The Americans, pressed for time and unfamiliar with the equipment, had not secured the Phoenix units and whales to the seabed with the same thoroughness as the British. The storm destroyed much of Mulberry A, tearing breakwaters loose, smashing pontoons, turning the harbor into a mass of twisted steel and broken concrete. Mulberry B, the British harbor at Arromanches, survived. British engineers had reinforced it with units salvaged from the American harbor and had pumped the Phoenix caissons full of sand to give them greater stability. This single harbor would now have to carry a greatly increased burden, supplying not just British and Canadian forces, but American units as well, until the port of Cherbourg could be captured and made operational. The British Mulberry, which had been designed for 90 days of hard use, would function for 8 full months. At its peak, it handled 12,000 tons of cargo and 2,500 vehicles per day. By the time it was finally decommissioned, more than 220,000 troops and 39,000 vehicles had landed through it, dry-shod and under protection. American generals, who had initially viewed the Mulberry project with skepticism, came to recognize it as essential to victory. Without the artificial harbors, the invasion would have been dependent on capturing Cherbourg quickly, or on supply rates so constrained that the Germans might have contained the beachhead. The harbors bought time, bought security, bought the margin for error that complex military operations always require. General Bradley, writing after the war, gave full credit to British engineering. The invasion of Europe, impossible without the artificial harbors, had been accomplished by British engineering. It was a generous and accurate assessment. The Americans had provided the troops, the ships, the industrial might to sustain the invasion, but the British had solved the fundamental problem of how to supply those forces, and they had done it with an engineering achievement that remains impressive 80 years later. Yet even the Mulberry harbors, for all their innovation, were only one part of the supply equation. Fuel consumption by modern armies was staggering, and the British had developed another solution so audacious that when American generals first heard about it, they were sure someone was joking.
The pipeline under the ocean. The conference room in Whitehall fell silent as Arthur Hartley, chief engineer of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, explained his proposal. It was early 1942, months before the COSSAC planning even began, but military planners already understood that any invasion of Europe would face a critical fuel supply problem. A modern mechanized army consumed fuel at rates that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations of soldiers. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, landing craft, everything drank gasoline or diesel at an astonishing pace. Conventional supply methods would not work. Tanker ships were slow, vulnerable to U-boats and air attack, and would clog the invasion beaches and harbors with their bulk. Someone asked if it might be possible to pump fuel through a pipeline the way oil fields supplied refineries inland. "Why not put the pipeline under the English Channel?" Hartley asked. The room erupted in objections. A submarine pipeline carrying fuel under one of the most turbulent bodies of water in the world, subject to currents, storms, and enemy action? The engineering challenges alone seemed insurmountable. The pipe would need to be flexible to lie along the irregular seafloor, yet strong enough to withstand enormous internal pressure. It would need to be resistant to corrosion from salt water. It would need to be laid without breaking and remain operational for months while armies advanced across France. Hartley insisted it could be done. The technology for submarine telephone cables existed. Why not adapt it to carry fuel instead of electrical signals? Remove the copper core and insulation, enlarge the diameter, strengthen the outer layers to withstand pressure. use ships equipped to lay cable to deploy the pipeline across the channel, connected on both ends to the existing British pipeline network, which could bring fuel from refineries in Liverpool, Bristol, and elsewhere to staging points on the south coast. The operation was given the code name PLUTO, originally standing for Pipeline Underwater Transportation of Oil, though some later claimed it meant pipeline under the ocean. Either way, it was the most audacious piece of the entire D-Day supply plan, and when American generals arrived in 1944 and were briefed on PLUTO, their reactions were remarkably consistent: stunned disbelief followed by grudging admiration. General Omar Bradley, reviewing the logistics plan, called PLUTO crazy, but acknowledged that crazy might be exactly what was needed. Conventional thinking would never supply the invasion. Perhaps unconventional thinking, British thinking, he was coming to realize, was the answer. Two types of pipe were developed for PLUTO. The first, called HAIS after its inventor H.A. Hammock of the Iraq Petroleum Company, was based on submarine cable design. It consisted of a 3-inch diameter lead pipe wrapped in steel tape and armored with additional layers of steel wire. Each mile of HAIS pipe weighed 46 tons and could carry fuel at high pressure over long distances. The second type, Hamel, was named for its inventors H.A. Hammock and B.J. Ellis of Burma Oil. Hamel used a steel pipe with a simpler construction and was slightly easier to manufacture and deploy. The pipes had to be stored somewhere until they were ready to be laid across the channel. British engineers developed massive drums called conundrums. The name supposedly came from their resemblance to gigantic puzzles. These drums were 30 feet in diameter and could hold up to 60 miles of pipe. They were 5 times the height of a man and weighed 250 tons when fully loaded. To deploy the pipe, 3 tugboats would tow a conundrum across the channel. As it moved, the drum would rotate, unwinding the pipe, which would settle to the seafloor. Ships were modified to carry and deploy the pipes. HMS Latimer and HMS Conundrum II became pipeline layers, their decks adapted to carry the enormous drums, their crews trained in the delicate operation of controlling the payout rate to prevent the pipe from breaking or tangling. The specialized vessels had to maintain precise speed and heading while the conundrums rotated behind them, steadily dispensing their cargo onto the channel floor. On land, pumping stations would be needed to push fuel through the pipelines at sufficient pressure to overcome resistance and maintain flow rates. These stations could not be ordinary industrial facilities. They would be prime targets for German bombing, so British engineers disguised them. Pumping stations on the Isle of Wight were built to look like ordinary houses and shops. One station was camouflaged as a bungalow, another as an ice cream parlor. From the air or at a distance, they appeared innocent. Up close, the heavy security and massive equipment inside revealed their true purpose. The pumping stations housed powerful machinery, capable of maintaining 50 to 70 bars of pressure, nearly 1,000 pounds per square inch. At such pressure, different fuels could be pumped through the same line sequentially without mixing, aviation gasoline followed by diesel, for example. This versatility would prove valuable as the demands of the invasion evolved. 2 routes were planned for PLUTO. The first, codenamed Bambi, would run 70 miles from Shanklin in Isle of Wight to Cherbourg in France, connecting to the port after it was captured. The second, codenamed Dumbo, would connect Dungeness in Kent to Boulogne, a distance of only 30 miles across the narrowest part of the channel. Together, the routes would eventually comprise 17 separate pipelines with a combined capacity of over 1 million gallons per day. American petroleum engineers brought in to consult on the project were impressed by the audacity, but concerned about reliability. What if the pipes broke? What if the pressure systems failed? What if German mines or sabotage disrupted the flow? British planners acknowledged all these risks and had backup plans. If PLUTO failed, conventional tankers would supply the armies, but if PLUTO succeeded, it would revolutionize military logistics.
Security around Pluto was extraordinary. The pipelines on land were buried wherever possible, running from Liverpool and Bristol through rural areas to the south coast. Where the pipeline had to cross drainage ditches or rivers, it was enclosed in concrete casings that obscured its purpose. Workers along the route knew only their specific section. Very few people understood the complete system. The Germans apparently never discovered Pluto, despite extensive air reconnaissance of southern England. This was partly due to camouflage and partly due to luck. German intelligence focused on the obvious preparations, ships, troops, aircraft, and missed the subtle signs of an underground fuel distribution network being assembled. The first attempts to lay the pipelines across the channel came in August 1944, after the Normandy beaches were secured. The operation proved more difficult than anticipated. Expert technicians had practiced laying pipes across the Bristol Channel and the Solent, but the English Channel presented greater challenges. Strong currents, variable depths, and the sheer width of the crossing complicated the work. HMS Latimer laid the first HAIS pipeline in just 10 hours on August 12, 1944, a remarkable achievement. But the pipeline failed when an escorting destroyer accidentally caught it with an anchor, damaging it beyond repair. A second attempt on September 22 succeeded initially, but then failed when pressure was increased from 50 to 70 bars and a coupling way gave. The learning process was expensive and frustrating.
British engineers persisted. On September 29th, HMS Conundrum 2 successfully installed a Hamel pipeline that worked, delivering 56,000 gallons per day. Gradually, more pipelines were laid, and the system became operational. By January 1945, Pluto was delivering 305 tons of fuel daily. By March, it was 3,048 tons daily. By May, at the war's end, it had delivered a total of 781,000 cubic meters of fuel, roughly 172 million gallons, to Allied forces in France. The historical assessment of Pluto's value has been debated. Some historians argue it came online too late to be decisive for the invasion itself. Cherbourg was captured on June 27, 1944, providing a conventional port for fuel deliveries months before Pluto was fully operational. But other historians note that Pluto proved crucial during the final push into Germany, when supply lines were stretched to the breaking point and conventional tanker routes were overcrowded. General Eisenhower, in his post-war memoirs, called Pluto second and daring only to the Mulberry harbors. Winston Churchill described it as a wholly British achievement and a piece of amphibious engineering skill of which we may well be proud. These assessments reflect not just Pluto's direct contribution, but its symbolic importance. It represented British willingness to attempt the impossible, to solve problems through innovation rather than brute force. This lesson that American material superiority could be enhanced by British innovation would shape Allied operations throughout the war and beyond. The special relationship between American power and British ingenuity, forged in part through projects like Pluto, would endure long after the war ended. But perhaps no British innovation shocked American generals more completely than the specialized armor developed by an eccentric British general who had been brought out of retirement to create tanks unlike anything in military history. Major General Percy Hobart was 57 years old in 1943, technically retired from the British Army after a distinguished but controversial career. He had pioneered armored warfare in the 1930s, had commanded the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, in Egypt, and had been forced into retirement because his views on how tanks should be used were considered too radical by conservative cavalry officers who still dominated the British Army. He had joined the Home Guard, preparing to defend Britain against German invasion, when Winston Churchill tracked him down. Churchill needed someone to solve an impossible problem: how to get tanks and infantry off the landing beaches and through German defenses on D-Day. Standard tanks would be slaughtered on the beaches. Infantry without armor support would be cut down.
Everything about the Atlantic Wall, the concrete bunkers, the steel obstacles, the mines, the anti-tank ditches, was designed to stop conventional armored attack. Churchill gave Hobart command of the 79th Armored Division and told him to make it unlike any armored division in history. Hobart threw himself into the task with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. Over the next year, he and his team would develop more than a dozen different types of specialized armored vehicles, each designed to solve a specific problem posed by beach assault and subsequent operations. When American generals first saw Hobart's creations in demonstrations in early 1944, they struggled to process what they were witnessing. These were not tanks in any conventional sense. They were engineering vehicles, psychological weapons, and sometimes something that looked more like a traveling circus than military equipment. Crews in the 79th Armored Division called them Funnies, and the name stuck. The British demonstrated the vehicles methodically, explaining each one's purpose and how it would function on D-Day. General Bradley and his staff watched in fascination. First came the DD tanks, duplex-drive Shermans. These were standard American-built Sherman tanks modified with a collapsible canvas screen and twin propellers. When the screen was raised and the propellers engaged, a 30-ton tank could swim. It could be launched from a landing craft thousands of yards offshore, swim through enemy fire, reach the beach, drop the canvas screen, and immediately engage as a normal tank. The Americans had seen amphibious vehicles before. The Duck amphibious truck was American-designed and widely used, but a swimming tank was different. American officers peppered the British with questions. How stable was it in rough water? What happened if the screen was punctured by enemy fire? Could the crew escape if it sank? The British answered honestly. The DD tank was not designed for heavy seas. It would sink if hit while in the water, but it gave the assault troops immediate armored support the moment they reached shore, and it could surprise German defenders who would not expect tanks to emerge from the waves.
Bradley approved the DD tanks for American use on D-Day. Tragically, on Omaha Beach, the decision to launch them too far offshore in rough conditions would result in 27 of 32 DD tanks sinking, drowning many of their crews. The British, launching closer to shore in calmer conditions on their beaches, would have better results. But the concept was sound, and the Americans recognized its value. Next, the British demonstrated the Crab, a Sherman tank with a rotating drum mounted on the front from which dozens of weighted chains extended. As the tank moved forward, the drum rotated rapidly and the chains beat the ground, detonating mines. The idea was not new. Similar flail tanks had been used in North Africa, but Hobart's version was improved, more reliable, and could clear a lane through a minefield while still being able to fight with its main gun. American engineers watched the Crab beat a path through a test minefield, the chains exploding practice mines with regular thumps. It was loud, intimidating, and effective. Bradley immediately requested Crab tanks for American forces, but there was insufficient time to produce enough and train crews before D-Day. The British and Canadians would use them extensively on their beaches with great success, while American forces at Omaha Beach would have to clear mines the hard way, at great cost in lives. The demonstrations continued. The Churchill AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, was a heavily modified Churchill tank with its main gun replaced by a petard multi-spigot mortar. This mortar fired a 40-pound high-explosive charge nicknamed the Flying Dustbin due to its size and shape. The round had a range of only 80 yards, but could demolish concrete bunkers and fortifications that conventional tank guns could barely scratch. American officers watched in awe as the petard mortar blasted apart a concrete replica of a German bunker. The explosion was tremendous, the effect devastating. One officer turned to a colleague and said, "We need those." But again, time was too short and the Americans would go into D-Day without AVREs. The British and Canadians would use them extensively on their beaches with great success, while American forces at Omaha Beach would have to clear mines the hard way, at great cost in lives. The demonstrations continued. The Churchill Ark,
Armored Vehicle Ramp Carrier, was a Churchill tank with the turret removed and ramps fitted to both ends. The Ark would drive into an anti-tank ditch or up to a seawall and become a bridge, allowing other vehicles to drive up one ramp, over the tank, and down the other side. The crew would remain inside their immobile tank, under fire, serving as a literal bridge for the Army to cross. American officers stared at the Ark in something like disbelief. The British were proposing to turn tanks into furniture, yet the logic was sound. Anti-tank ditches and seawalls would stop conventional armor. The Ark could breach these obstacles in minutes, turning an impassable barrier into a crossing point. The Americans had no equivalent vehicle. There were more. The Centaur bulldozer, a tank with the turret removed and a bulldozer blade fitted, capable of clearing obstacles while keeping up with armored formations. The Canal Defense Light, which was not actually for canal defense, but was a deliberate misnomer to maintain secrecy. It carried a powerful searchlight to blind and disorient enemy forces during night operations. The breadth of Hobart's imagination and the technical skill of British engineers in realizing his vision impressed every American officer who witnessed the demonstrations. These were not random modifications, but a comprehensive system of specialized vehicles, each designed to solve specific problems identified through careful analysis of beach assault requirements. Yet the Americans, for the most part, declined to use most of the Funnies. General Bradley's reasoning was practical, if ultimately costly. The specialized vehicles based on the Churchill tank would require the Americans to add another tank model to their logistics chain, which was already complex. The vehicles would need specialized training for crews and maintenance personnel. There was not enough time before D-Day to integrate them fully into American operations. The British understood but were disappointed. They had offered their innovations freely, had demonstrated their effectiveness, had been willing to provide training and support. The American decision to rely primarily on standard equipment, except for DD tanks and some bulldozer tanks, meant that American forces on D-Day would face problems the British had already solved, but would have to solve them again through improvisation and sacrifice. The difference would be stark on June 6th. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Funnies would perform brilliantly. DD tanks would swim ashore and provide immediate fire support. Crabs would clear lanes through minefields. AVREs would demolish bunkers. Fascines would seal ditches. The specialized armor would turn what could have been a slaughter into a manageable assault with acceptable casualties. At Omaha Beach, where American forces landed with minimal specialized armor, the story would be different. Without crabs, engineers had to clear mines by hand under fire. Without AVREs, bunkers had to be attacked with SACO charges and grenades at terrible cost. Without bobbins, vehicles bogged down in the soft sand. The American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions would take the beach through raw courage and determination, but the casualties would be staggering, more than all the British and Canadian beaches combined. General Bradley, reviewing the results afterward, would acknowledge that the specialized armor made a critical difference. The British and Canadians achieved their objectives on D-Day with casualties far lower than expected. The Americans at Omaha Beach suffered far higher casualties than planned. Equipment, Bradley concluded, could not replace courage, but it could significantly reduce the price of victory. Hobart's Funnies would continue to prove their worth throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond. As the Allies pushed towards Germany, the specialized armor would help cross rivers, breach the Siegfried Line, clear paths through rubble and destroyed cities. The 79th Armored Division, which never fought as a complete formation, but instead attached its specialized units to conventional divisions as needed, would build and operate nearly 7,000 specialized vehicles by war's end. American forces would eventually adopt some of the British innovations, particularly after Normandy demonstrated their value, but the initial American skepticism, followed by the recognition of what had been missed, left a lasting impression on American military planners. Littlehart, the British military historian, would write that Hobart made it a hat trick by his subsequent training of the 79th Armored Division, the decisive factor on D-Day. That assessment, that specialized equipment was decisive, reflected a larger truth about British D-Day preparations that American generals were coming to understand. The British had thought through every aspect of the operation with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. They had identified problems, developed solutions, tested them, refined them, and prepared to use them. They had not relied on traditional approaches or assumed that courage and firepower alone would prevail. This thoroughness extended beyond the dramatic innovations like Fortitude, Mulberry, PLUTO, and the Funnies. It pervaded every aspect of the planning, down to details that American generals initially thought mundane, but came to recognize as essential.
The Intelligence War, Knowing the Enemy. The war room at Southwick House contained a scale model of the Normandy coastline so detailed that officers could examine individual houses in French villages. The model was built from thousands of aerial reconnaissance photographs, cross-referenced with reports from French resistance fighters, interviews with Norman émigrés in Britain, and geological surveys dating back decades. Every German defensive position visible from the air or sea had been marked. Every beach obstacle had been catalogued. American intelligence officers, used to working with maps and reports, stared at the model in something approaching awe. This was intelligence collection on a scale they had not seen before. The British had spent years building this picture of German defenses, and they had done it through methods that combined cutting-edge technology with old-fashioned human intelligence in ways the Americans were only beginning to understand. The reconnaissance effort had begun immediately after Dunkirk in 1940, when Britain stood alone against Germany, and the prospect of eventually returning to France seemed distant and almost hopeless. But British planners had assumed from the start that someday they would return, and they had begun gathering information about the French coast systematically. RAF reconnaissance aircraft flew regular missions over France, photographing the coastline and German fortifications. The flights were dangerous. German fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down many reconnaissance planes, but the missions continued. Thousands of photographs were taken, developed, analyzed by interpreters who noted every new bunker, every gun emplacement, every change in German defensive preparations. The photography was supplemented by more dangerous methods. The British developed miniature submarines called X-craft that could slip close to shore undetected. These submarines carried specially trained naval officers who would swim to the beach at night, collect samples of sand and rock, take measurements of tides and currents, and photograph obstacles from close range. The data they gathered was essential for determining whether beaches could support armored vehicles and whether landing craft could approach safely. One such mission, Operation Bell Push, nearly ended in disaster. On the night of January 30th, 1944, an X-craft approached the Normandy coast to conduct final reconnaissance. Fog rolled in, limiting visibility. German lookouts heard the submarine's engines. The crafts had to abort and retreat, the mission incomplete. But enough information had been gathered from previous missions to proceed with planning. The French resistance provided the other critical source of intelligence. French patriots living under German occupation watched the enemy constantly, noting troop movements, fortification construction, changes in garrison strength. They passed this information to Britain through clandestine radio transmissions, through agents who made perilous journeys back to England, through coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent letters. Coordinating with the resistance required delicate handling. Different resistance groups had different loyalties. Some supported Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement, others followed different leaders. Some were communists, others conservative nationalists. The British had to work with all of them, reconciling conflicting information, verifying reports, ensuring that preparations for D-Day did not alert the Germans to where the invasion would come. American intelligence officers, as they learned the extent of British cooperation with the resistance, gained new appreciation for the complexity of the task. This was not just military intelligence, but a comprehensive intelligence operation that blended espionage, reconnaissance, signal intercepts, and coordination with irregular forces into a unified picture of enemy capabilities and positions. The crown jewel of British intelligence was Ultra, the program to break German Enigma codes. American officers had been briefed on Ultra's existence, and some had been given limited access to its product.
But as they integrated into the D-Day planning structure, they gained fuller appreciation for how thoroughly the British had penetrated German communications. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. They used it for all sensitive communications, confident that even if messages were intercepted, they could never be decrypted in time to be useful. They were wrong. British code breakers at Bletchley Park, led by mathematical genius Alan Turing and staffed by cryptanalysts, linguists, and thousands of support personnel, had broken Enigma and could read many German messages almost as quickly as the intended recipients. Ultra provided insights into German thinking about the invasion. It revealed which deception efforts were working and which were not. It allowed planners to track German troop movements, to understand which units were stationed where, to assess enemy readiness and morale. The intelligence was so valuable that extraordinary measures were taken to protect its secrecy. Information derived from Ultra could never be acted upon directly if so doing might reveal to the Germans that their codes were broken. American planners learned to use Ultra carefully, to cross-reference it with other intelligence sources, to act on it only when the action could be plausibly attributed to another source. The discipline required was challenging, but the payoff was enormous. Going into D-Day, the Allies knew more about German dispositions in France than German field commanders knew about adjacent sectors. The integration of all these intelligence sources, aerial reconnaissance, submarine surveys, resistance reports, ultra decrypts, into a comprehensive operational picture was a British achievement that American officers studied carefully. The U.S. military would adopt many of these techniques, would build its own intelligence infrastructure based on British models, would develop its own methods for fusing multiple intelligence streams into actionable information. But in early 1944, it was the British who led the way. They had the experience, the systems, the trained personnel. American intelligence officers attached to the D-Day planning staffs were essentially apprentices, learning from masters how to conduct intelligence operations at strategic scale. The thoroughness extended to seemingly minor details. The British had agents measure the sand on Normandy beaches to determine its bearing capacity, how much weight it would support before vehicles sank. They had surveyed the gradient of the beaches to calculate how far landing craft could approach before grounding. They had analyzed the composition of German concrete to determine what weapons would be needed to crack it. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was assumed. Every piece of information was verified through multiple sources when possible. The result was an intelligence picture so complete that when D-Day came, there were few surprises about the terrain or the enemy positions. The surprises that did occur, the strength of resistance at Omaha Beach, the difficulty of fighting in the Normandy bagage, came not from failures in intelligence collection, but from factors that could not be known in advance. American generals reviewing the intelligence preparations recognized them as world-class work. The British had created a template for how to conduct intelligence for large-scale operations, a template that would be used and refined for decades afterward. The intelligence preparations for D-Day would influence how the United States approached intelligence for operations in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. But intelligence gathering and planning would be useless without trained forces ready to execute the plan, and here, too, the British preparation impressed their American allies.
Training for the impossible, rehearsals and preparation. The waters off Slapton Sands in Devon looked deceptively peaceful on the morning of April 27, 1944. The beach itself bore a strong resemblance to Utah Beach in Normandy. The same gently sloping sand, the same tidal patterns, the same backdrop of small villages and farmland. That resemblance was why the British had chosen Slapton Sands for Exercise Tiger, a full-scale rehearsal of the D-Day landings. More than 30,000 American troops were participating in the exercise, practicing the complex choreography of amphibious assault. Landing craft would bring troops ashore under simulated fire from British forces, playing the role of German defenders. Tanks would roll off LSTs onto the beach. Artillery would establish firing positions. Communication networks would be tested. Everything would be as close to real combat conditions as possible. The rehearsal would end in tragedy.
German E-boats, fast attack craft, slipped past the naval escorts and torpedoed several landing ships, killing 749 American servicemen. The disaster was a brutal reminder that even training exercises in war were deadly, but it also demonstrated the wisdom of the British insistence on realistic rehearsals. The Americans, arriving in Britain in huge numbers throughout late 1943 and early 1944, needed training. Most U.S. Army units had never conducted amphibious operations. Most soldiers had never worked with naval forces or coordinated air support. The complexity of D-Day, simultaneous landings across 5 beaches, airborne operations behind enemy lines, naval bombardment, air attacks, required rehearsal or chaos would result. The British had prepared an elaborate training infrastructure. Across southern England, they had identified beaches and terrain that resembled the Normandy landing sites. They had evacuated entire villages, displacing thousands of civilians to create training areas. The sacrifices these civilians made, leaving homes, businesses, farms, were substantial, but necessary. The training areas had to be realistic. American units rotated through these training areas, practicing assaults again and again. British officers served as advisors, bringing experience from Dieppe, from North Africa, from Sicily. They taught American soldiers what to expect, how to work with tanks, how to clear obstacles under fire, how to communicate when radios failed and noise was overwhelming. The British also trained American units in more specialized skills. Paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions rehearsed night jumps, learned to assemble in darkness after scattered drops, practiced attacking specific types of German fortifications. Rangers trained for cliff assault, preparing for the mission at Point du Hoc, where they would scale 100-foot cliffs under fire to destroy German artillery positions. The scale of the training operation impressed American commanders. The British had thought through not just what needed to be taught, but how to teach it efficiently to tens of thousands of men in limited time. Training manuals were produced, clear, detailed, illustrated guides to every aspect of amphibious operations. Films were made showing correct and incorrect techniques. Mock-ups of German fortifications were built, so soldiers could practice assaulting them with the right tactics. Special attention was given to coordination between services. Soldiers needed to understand how naval gunfire support worked, how to call in airstrikes, how to recognize friendly aircraft so they did not fire on them by mistake. Sailors needed to understand how to maneuver landing craft under fire, how to time their approach to beaches with tides, how to extract damaged craft and wounded men. The tragic events of Exercise Tiger, despite the loss of life, provided valuable lessons. The naval escorts had been inadequate. More destroyers were assigned to protect the actual invasion fleet. Communication between ships had been poor. Better radio procedures were implemented. The E-boat attack showed that German coastal forces remained active and dangerous. More extensive minesweeping and patrol operations were planned for D-Day. After Tiger, additional exercises were conducted with tighter security and better protection. Exercise Fabius in early May 1944 was the final full-scale rehearsal involving forces that would land on all 5 beaches. More than 100,000 troops participated. The lessons from Tiger had been absorbed, and Fabius went smoothly, building confidence that the actual invasion could be executed successfully. The British also trained their own specialized units to support the Americans. Teams of Royal Engineers practiced demolition work alongside U.S. Army engineers. British beach parties rehearsed directing traffic, ensuring vehicles did not bog down on the sand, controlling the flow of men and equipment off the beaches. Royal Navy landing craft crews trained with their American counterparts, learning signals and procedures to ensure smooth coordination. Medical evacuation received particular attention. The British had developed sophisticated plans for handling casualties, and they trained American medical personnel in their methods. Hospital ships were positioned, beach casualty clearing stations were prepared, evacuation routes were planned. The goal was to move wounded men from the front line to hospital beds in Britain as quickly as possible, saving lives through rapid treatment. American officers observing the training regime were impressed by its thoroughness. General Eisenhower personally visited training areas, watching soldiers practice assaults, talking to men about their preparation. He came away confident that the training, combined with the quality of American soldiers, would translate to success on D-Day. But training alone would not ensure victory. The invasion required a logistical effort of staggering scale, and here again, the British preparation amazed their American allies.
The invisible logistics. Supplying Overlord. The south of England had become one vast military camp by spring 1944. Everywhere you looked, there were soldiers, vehicles, supplies. Airfields hosted thousands of aircraft. Ports were crammed with ships. Warehouses bulged with ammunition, food, fuel, medicine. The scale of the buildup was unprecedented, and managing it required organizational genius. British logistics planners had spent years developing the infrastructure to support the invasion. This was not simply a matter of gathering supplies. It required organizing staging areas, routing convoys, managing port capacities, ensuring that units had what they needed when they needed it without creating bottlenecks that would paralyze the entire operation. Southern England was divided into marshalling areas, each designated to support specific units. American divisions assigned to Utah Beach staged in the southwest. Units bound for Omaha Beach gathered in the south-central region. British and Canadian forces assembled near the channel ports. The separation prevented overcrowding and made movement to embarkation ports simpler on D-Day. But getting units into position was only part of the challenge. Those units needed supplies, and the variety and quantity of supplies required for an invasion staggered the imagination. The British, working with American logistics officers, created detailed load plans for every ship. Combat vehicles and ammunition went first. Food and medical supplies followed. Fuel was distributed across multiple ships to reduce the risk that a single sinking would cripple the fuel supply. The British had also organized the repair and maintenance infrastructure necessary to keep equipment operational. Workshops throughout southern England were preparing spare parts, training mechanics, stockpiling tools and materials. When tanks broke down, and they would break down, parts and technicians would need to be available quickly, or entire units would be immobilized. American logistics officers, trained in an army that thought big, were nonetheless impressed by the detail of British planning. The British had considered everything. They had planned for the disposal of waste, human and mechanical. They had organized systems for handling mail, for processing casualties, for burying the dead. They had prepared for problems no one wanted to think about, but which would inevitably arise. The rail network in southern England was pushed to capacity, moving supplies and troops. British railway officials coordinated with military planners to ensure civilian traffic was not completely disrupted while military needs were met. Trains ran day and night, following complex schedules that kept goods flowing without gridlock. Roads were another challenge. Thousands of vehicles would need to move from staging areas to embarkation points in the days before D-Day. The British drew up detailed traffic plans, assigning routes, timing movements so different units would not collide, preparing military police detachments to direct traffic at key intersections. Road signs in southern England were changed to military designations. Civilians were confused, but units could navigate to their assigned positions. Security was woven through the logistics planning. Supply dumps were camouflaged. Movements occurred at night when possible. Radio silence was enforced to prevent German directing finding from determining where forces were concentrating. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but they must not learn when or where. The British also managed the accumulation of specific specialized equipment required for the invasion. In addition to the Mulberry components and PLUTO pipeline sections, there were thousands of beach obstacles to be cleared, requiring massive numbers of demolition charges and specialized tools. There were communications equipment, radios by the thousands, cables by the mile. There were bridging equipment, engineering stores, medical supplies far beyond the normal scale.
The total quantity of supplies accumulated in Britain for D-Day approached 5 million tons. Managing this hoard, ensuring it was organized properly, preventing pilferage and waste, required a logistics organization of enormous sophistication. The British, with their experience managing a global empire, had the administrative capacity to handle it. American officers learned from watching how the British made such a complex system work. One American logistics officer reviewing the supply plans in March 1944 told his British counterpart that he had never seen anything so comprehensive. The British officer replied that they had learned the hard way, at Dunkirk, in Norway, in Greece, that poor logistics could doom even the best tactical plans. They were determined not to repeat those mistakes. The preparations extended to contingencies. What if the invasion had to be postponed? They had planned for that, ensuring supplies could be maintained in staging areas for weeks if necessary. What if certain beaches proved unusable? They had alternate landing sites identified and had prepared plans to redirect forces. What if supply ships were sunk in large numbers? They had calculated minimum supply rates and had backup reserves. This thoroughness, this refusal to assume anything would go according to plan, characterized all British preparation. They had learned through bitter experience that war was chaos, that even the best plans went awry, that success came to those who prepared for problems as well as for success. As D-Day approached, the extent of British preparation became clear to every American general involved in the planning. What they had initially viewed as typical British caution revealed itself as prudent foresight. The British were not being pessimistic, they were being realistic about the challenges ahead and were preparing to meet those challenges with solutions already developed and tested. But all the planning, all the preparation, all the innovation would be useless if the Germans learned what the Allies intended. Keeping the secret was perhaps the most important challenge of all.
The Sacred Trust, Security and Secrecy. On May 22, 1944, British security services arrested an American general. Major General Henry Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff at Allied Headquarters, had attended a party at Claridge's Hotel in London and, apparently loosened by alcohol, had mentioned in conversation that the invasion would occur before June 15th. British intelligence officers who monitored such social events precisely to catch such leaks immediately reported the comment. General Eisenhower was informed, and Miller was sent back to the United States in disgrace, his career destroyed. The Miller incident illustrated the extraordinary security measures surrounding D-Day preparation. The invasion was the worst-kept secret of the war. Everyone knew it was coming, but the crucial details of when and where could not be revealed. German intelligence was actively trying to determine Allied intentions. One loose comment, one careless disclosure could give the Germans the information they needed to concentrate forces and turn D-Day into a disaster. The British had created a comprehensive security apparatus to protect operational secrecy. It began with compartmentalization, limiting knowledge of specific details to only those who needed to know. Soldiers training for the invasion were told they were preparing for an attack on France, but not where or when. Civilians living near staging areas were aware of military buildup, but were prevented from leaving the area to carry information elsewhere. Southern England became essentially a sealed zone in the weeks before D-Day. Travel to and from the region was restricted, mail was censored, telephone calls were monitored. Anyone found discussing military matters was subject to investigation and potential arrest. The restrictions were oppressive, and some resented them, but security was paramount. Foreign diplomats in London posed a particular challenge. Neutral embassies employed staff from various countries, some of whom might sympathize with Germany. The British monitored diplomatic communications carefully, watching for any indication that details of the invasion might be leaking through neutral channels. In one case, a diplomatic pouch was seized and searched after intelligence suggested it might contain information about Allied plans. The press was another concern.
British and American journalists knew about the buildup and were eager to report it, but reporters agreed to voluntary censorship, withholding information that could help the enemy. Articles about training exercises were published only after careful review by military censors. Photographs showing military equipment or installations were prohibited unless they revealed nothing about operational plans. American generals, used to somewhat more relaxed security practices, adapted to British standards. General Patton, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping quiet, chafed under restrictions on what he could say and to whom, but even Patton recognized the stakes. One careless word from him about FUSAG might undermine the entire Fortitude deception. The strictest security surrounded the actual invasion plans. Only a small circle of officers knew the complete picture: Eisenhower, Montgomery, the senior commanders of each service. Everyone else knew only their piece of the operation. Invasion plans were kept in safes, distributed only to those with specific need to know, collected back after briefings. Every copy was numbered and tracked. As D-Day approached, security became even tighter. Troops were moved into marshalling areas where they were essentially confined. No one could leave, no mail could be sent. The men knew something big was coming, but not exactly what or when. The confinement was hard on morale, but it prevented any last-minute leaks. One remarkable security success concerned the Daily Telegraph crossword puzzle. In May 1944, the puzzle included several words that were D-Day code names: Utah, Omaha, Overlord, Mulberry, Neptune. MI5 investigated immediately. Was this coincidence or sabotage? They interrogated the puzzle's compiler, Leonard Daw, a schoolmaster. He insisted it was pure chance. The investigators were skeptical, but eventually concluded he was telling the truth. Years later, one of Daw's former students revealed that the teacher often asked pupils for words to use in his puzzles, and many students lived near U.S. military camps where they heard soldiers using the code words. Daw had unwittingly incorporated them without understanding their significance. The incident, though ultimately harmless, showed how carefully security was maintained. Any anomaly was investigated thoroughly. Nothing was dismissed as mere coincidence without proof. Despite all precautions, some information inevitably leaked. The British knew German intelligence was receiving reports about the buildup, but the key details, the exact date and location, remained secret, and that was what mattered. The Germans knew an invasion was coming to France. They did not know it would come on June 6th in Normandy. The success of these security measures would become clear only after D-Day. German forces were caught by surprise, not about the possibility of invasion, but about its timing and location. Fortitude worked in part because it aligned with German expectations, but it also worked because real information about Allied plans never reached German intelligence in time to be useful. American security officers, studying British methods, learned valuable lessons about operational security. The United States military would adopt many of these practices, would develop its own sophisticated security systems based on British models. But in 1944, it was British security services leading the way, demonstrating how to protect secrets in an era of total war. Yet, operational security was only one dimension of the intelligence war. The British were also waging a campaign to blind German reconnaissance and to ensure Allied forces would own the skies over Normandy.
Mastery of the skies, air superiority preparation. On the night of May 31, 1944, hundreds of British and American bombers crossed the English Channel and attacked targets across northern France. The raids were part of the Transportation Plan, a systematic campaign to cripple the French railway network and road system, making it difficult for Germans to move reinforcements to Normandy after the invasion began. The Transportation Plan was controversial when British planners first proposed it. American airmen, particularly Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, argued that the strategic bombing campaign should focus on German oil production and war industries. Destroying railway yards and bridges in France seemed like a waste of effort that would also kill French civilians.
The British insisted German reinforcements would arrive by train and truck. Without the ability to move forces rapidly, the Germans would have to rely on units already in Normandy, making the invasion far more likely to succeed. Eisenhower sided with the British, and the transportation plan was implemented despite American reservations. The bombing campaign was massive. Over 3 months, Allied aircraft flew more than 200,000 sorties and dropped 195,000 tons of bombs on French transportation targets. Railway marshalling yards were devastated, bridges were dropped into rivers, road junctions were cratered. The French rail network, which the Germans depended on for moving troops and supplies, was reduced to perhaps 30% effectiveness by D-Day. French civilian casualties from the bombing were substantial, several thousand killed, many more wounded. This troubled the Allied commanders, particularly Eisenhower, who agonized over the decision. But the alternative, allowing the Germans to move reinforcements quickly to Normandy, could mean failure of the invasion and many more deaths, Allied and French alike. The air campaign was not limited to transportation targets. In the weeks before D-Day, Allied aircraft systematically attacked German radar stations along the coast, blinding the enemy's ability to detect the invasion fleet. Fighter bombers strafed German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and disrupting Luftwaffe operations. Heavy bombers attacked coastal fortifications, particularly at Pas de Calais, reinforcing the Fortitude deception that the invasion would come there. By June 1944, Allied air superiority over France was total. The Luftwaffe could barely mount token resistance. Allied fighters and fighter bombers ranged freely over France, attacking any German unit that moved during daylight. This air supremacy was essential. Without it, the invasion fleet crossing the Channel would have been terribly vulnerable, and the landing beaches would have been subjected to devastating air attacks. American airmen who had contributed significantly to achieving air superiority recognized that British planning had made optimal use of that superiority. The transportation plan, despite American initial skepticism, proved crucial. When German forces tried to move toward Normandy after June 6th, they found the rail system destroyed, bridges impassable, roads interdicted by fighter bombers. Panzer divisions that should have reached the battlefield in 24 hours took a week, arrived piecemeal, and were committed to battle in conditions where Allied air power could devastate them. General Bradley, assessing the contribution of air power to D-Day's success, gave credit to the strategic vision behind the transportation plan. The British had thought through how air power could directly support the invasion beyond just attacking German forces. They had identified the enemy's mobility as a vulnerability and had systematically destroyed it. This was operational level thinking, and it worked brilliantly. The air preparations extended to direct support for the landings. Hundreds of transport aircrafts were organized to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. Gliders were assembled to carry heavy equipment and additional troops. Airborne operations at night were risky. Paratroopers would be scattered, many would miss their drop zones, some would be killed before reaching the ground. But the British insisted that disrupting German communications and seizing key bridges and road junctions behind the beaches was essential. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop in the western sector, supporting Utah Beach. British 6th Airborne Division would land in the east, securing the flank of Sword Beach. The operations were carefully planned, with specific objectives assigned to each unit. Despite inevitable confusion and casualties, the airborne drops would achieve their goals, seizing bridges, blocking German reinforcement routes, creating chaos in the enemy rear. All these air operations, the transportation plan, the attacks on radar and airfields, the airborne drops, were coordinated into a comprehensive plan that used air power as an integral part of the invasion rather than as a separate supporting effort. This integration was characteristic of British planning. Nothing was viewed in isolation. Every element of the operation was designed to support other elements, creating synergies that multiplied effectiveness. As D-Day approached and the final preparations fell into place, the magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. American generals who had arrived in Britain expecting to lead the planning found themselves partners in the most comprehensive military operation ever conceived.
The final hours. Eisenhower's decision. The weather forecast was terrible. Group Captain James Stagg, the RAF meteorologist responsible for advising Eisenhower, stood in the briefing room at Southwick House on the evening of June 4, 1944, and delivered the news everyone dreaded. The storm approaching the English Channel showed no signs of relenting. If the invasion launched on June 5 as planned, the fleet would cross in heavy seas, making the DD tanks unusable, disrupting landing craft approaches, increasing casualties. Eisenhower faced the loneliest decision in military history: postpone the invasion and risk losing the narrow window of favorable tides and moonlight required for the airborne drops and beach landings, or proceed and risk disaster in the storm. There was no good option. The room was full of the most senior Allied commanders. Montgomery wanted to go. He had trained his forces to peak readiness, and delay might dull their edge. Admiral Bertram Ramsay was prepared to commit the fleet, but acknowledged the risks. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory worried that aircraft would not be able to support the landing in bad weather. The weight of the decision rested solely on Eisenhower. He alone had the authority to launch or postpone. He alone would be held accountable if the invasion failed. He had already drafted a message taking personal responsibility for failure, a message that would be released if the landings were thrown back into the sea. Eisenhower postponed. D-Day would not be June 5th. The fleet, already at sea, turned back. Troops confined in their assault craft for hours were returned to embarkation camps. The delay created new risks. Could the secret be kept for another day? Would German reconnaissance detect the fleet's movement and deduce Allied intentions? Then Stagg returned with new information. His meteorologists predicted a brief window of better weather on June 6th. It would not be ideal conditions. The seas would still be rough, the skies cloudy, but it would be marginally acceptable. After June 6th, the weather would worsen again, and the tidal conditions required for the invasion would not recur for weeks. Eisenhower polled his commanders again. What did they think? Should they go or wait? Montgomery was emphatic: go. The British general had built his career on careful preparation, but now he argued for boldness. The German Meteorological Service, lacking access to weather data from the Atlantic that British and American forecasters could draw on, would not predict the break in the weather. The Germans would be caught unprepared. Ramsay and Leigh-Mallory offered tentative agreement. The conditions were far from ideal, but they were acceptable. The fleet could sail. Aircraft could operate, though with more difficulty than in clear weather. Eisenhower made his decision. Okay, we'll go. In that moment, years of British planning and American power converged into a single word. All the innovations, Fortitude, Mulberry, PLUTO, the Funnies, the intelligence, the training, the logistics, would be tested in the crucible of battle. The greatest amphibious invasion in history would launch, and the fate of millions rested on whether the preparation had been adequate. Throughout the night of June 5-6, the invasion fleet crossed the Channel. More than 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 troops moved through the darkness toward France. Overhead, transport aircraft and gliders carried 3 airborne divisions toward their drop zones. In Britain, the millions of tons of supplies, the backup forces, the medical evacuation system, the entire support structure assembled over months, prepared to sustain the invasion force. The British had planned for every contingency they could imagine. They had developed innovations that seemed impossible and made them real. They had thought through details others had overlooked.
They had created a blueprint for modern joint operations that would influence military planning for generations. American generals who had come to Britain expecting to teach had instead learned. They had learned that thorough preparation could multiply effectiveness. They had learned that innovation could overcome limitations in resources. They had learned that cleverness could defeat strength. They had learned respect for their British allies, respect that would endure long after the war ended. Dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, revealing thousands of ships offshore and aircraft overhead. German defenders, shocked by the scale and location of the attack, scrambled to respond. The invasion had come to Normandy, exactly as British planning had intended, precisely where German intelligence had been deceived into not expecting it. The battle was joined. The outcome remained uncertain, but because of British preparation and American power combined, the Allies had given themselves the best possible chance of victory.
Conclusion: the legacy of Allied innovation. Standing on the cliffs above Omaha Beach in June 1945, exactly 1 year after D-Day, General Omar Bradley reflected on what the Allied forces had accomplished. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The invasion that had seemed so daunting, so fraught with risk, had succeeded beyond anyone's most optimistic predictions. Bradley thought about the shock he had experienced when he first learned the extent of British preparations. He had arrived in Britain expecting to find planning still in preliminary stages, expecting American efficiency and industrial might to carry the operation. Instead, he had found British innovation and thoroughness that exceeded anything he had seen. The artificial harbors still sat off the Norman coast, battered but functional. PLUTO pipelines stretched under the channel, having delivered millions of gallons of fuel that sustained the drive into Germany. The wreckage of Hobart's Funnies littered battlefields across France and Germany, testament to their use and effectiveness. The success of Operation Fortitude had become legend, perhaps the greatest deception in military history. American military planners had absorbed the lessons. The United States had always been strong in producing weapons and mobilizing industrial power, but the British had demonstrated that success required more than material superiority. It required careful intelligence gathering, thorough planning, willingness to innovate, attention to detail, and the ability to integrate all elements of military power into a coherent whole. These lessons would shape American military doctrine for decades. The emphasis on joint operations, Army, Navy, Air Force working together seamlessly, came directly from the D-Day experience. The recognition that intelligence and deception operations could be war-winning rather than merely supporting came from Fortitude. The understanding that engineering and logistics could be as important as combat power came from Mulberry and PLUTO. The value of specialized equipment designed for specific missions came from the Funnies. The special relationship between Britain and the United States, forged in war and strengthened by mutual respect, would endure through the Cold War and beyond. It was built not just on common values and shared language, but on the experience of working together toward victory, with each nation contributing its unique strengths. The British had brought experience, sophistication, and innovation born of fighting alone when the situation seemed hopeless. The Americans had brought fresh power, optimism, and industrial capacity that turned plans into reality. Together, they had achieved what neither could have accomplished separately.